So today is Labor Day 2023. I'm going to brew an IPA today, but before I do that, I need to harvest some hops. That's right, I'm brewing a Wet Hopped IPA with all these fresh grown hops. Well, hey there, my name is Brent. Thanks for stopping by Cascades Homebrew. That's right, today we're going to brew a fresh hop, Wet Hopped IPA. So I'm here in my backyard. I'm not quite sure how much hops I'm going to get off my plants this year. Looking at them, I can definitely see that the Chinook yield is going to be lower than it has in the last couple of years. So I believe last year after drying, I had about 12 ounces of dried cone hops. I think I'll probably get less than that this year. So wet hops, usually there's a conversion about 5 ounces of wet hops, kind of as roughly maybe about an ounce. So what's gonna look like a lot of hops going in this beer, hopefully. Worst case, if I don't get a lot of hops off my plants this year, I've got some hops left over from last year that I can use to supplement. And I'm thinking I'm gonna use some Warrior at the beginning of the boil, just to make sure I have a good bitterness backbone. So 2 years ago, I made an IPA. There I used hops that I grew and dried them out and then put them in. I think that one, I had a really plain grain bill. I think it was just 50-50 of like a Maris Otter and a 2-row. And I think I didn't get enough bitterness in it overall. So I'm hoping to drack up a little bit of the grain complexity in this one with maybe some Munich, some Vienna, a little crystal malt. And I think we're looking to jack up the IBUs, hopefully a combination of these wet hops that I'm harvesting today, the Warrior at the beginning, and maybe some of last year's. All right, well, stick around though, but before I can brew, I need to get these hops harvested. So I knew my hop harvest was going to be down this year, but I was hoping I would get more than just that 10 ounces of wet hops. Oh well, I've got those frozen hops from last year in the freezer, so I will put those to use. So I'm calling this beer my 2023 Wet Hopped IPA. It's kind of cheating. IPAs are usually dry hopped. I didn't dry hop this batch, and also only a little bit of the hops, percentage-wise at least, were the wet hops from this year. But hey, call it what you want. It turned out as a pretty nice looking beer. Well, let's take a quick look at the brew day and the recipe. Come back and taste this beer. We'll see, is growing your own hops, are they worth it? Is it fun? Do they make good beer? So like I said, this is my 2023 Wet Hop IPA. We're calling it a kind of American IPA. I'm shooting for 5.5 gallons or 21 liters into the fermenter. So the calculated bitterness, 104 IBUs, that's not really close to reality. Even with jiggering the recipe and lowering the alpha acids on the hops that I grew, it calculated pretty big. But I knew it wasn't going to be that bitter. Color, it's kind of a nice golden 7 SRM. So as I look at my target numbers for the beer, I wouldn't pay too much attention to the exact numbers. So I was shooting for about a 6.5% beer. I ended up really drastically undershooting my original gravity. I think I must have mismeasured my base grain. So I ended up using some sugar to add it in. So the numbers we're looking at are kind of what I was planning versus what the recipe would have done if I had the full amount of grain and the sugar. So quick look at the water. So I needed about 9 gallons or 34 liters of my tap water. To that, I added 7.4 milliliters of lactic acid. I was targeting a pH around 5.35. Then to adjust the minerals in my water, I had 8 grams of gypsum, 2 grams of calcium chloride. Then I also added 1.8 grams of Oxblox 3D from Cellar Science. So this will both remove the chlorine and chloramine from my water, but it's also supposedly maybe help lower the oxygen in the water. I'm not quite sure if that's going to make a difference, but I've kind of been curious about, lowering the oxygen on the hot side. So oxalate is basically a combination of metabisulfites, also with some ascorbic acid, and then Brutan B. So those are a combination that's supposed to help with the oxidation. So the planned grain bill went on this one. 77% of a 2-row, that would have been 11.5 pounds or 5.2 kilograms. 10% or 1.5 pounds or 680 grams of Weyermann Vienna malt. 3.3% or half a pound or 227 grams of Munich 2 malt from Weyermann, and another same 3.3% or half a pound or 227 grams of a Crystal 40. So some of the grain bill was, using up some of the grains I had around, but I think it's a pretty solid grain bill. So I had 1.5 pounds of that Vienna malt that I wanted to use up. I had a half a pound that I had bought pre-ground of that Munich malt. But I like the idea of some Munich malt, crystal malt, and then the Vienna malt in there. I thought might give it a little bit of maltiness, but without adding a lot of sweetness to it. Like I said, I think when I look back that I probably didn't measure my base grain quite right. So I ended up probably with 2 pounds less. Like I said, I added some sugar in later to balance that out. And the additional sugar brought me up pretty close to sort of my target gravity and my target ABV. The planned mash for this was 60 minutes at 152 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 66.7 degrees Celsius. Actually came in a little higher than that, 155 degrees Fahrenheit where I started at, or 68 degrees Celsius. Again, that's probably another sign that I just didn't have quite as much grain as I had planned for the calculator. But even though starting at that higher mash temperature, basically I just let it go uninsulated. I knew the temperature would drop a little bit, and I figured it would be fine. Mash temperature has a little impact on the ABV and the attenuation of the beer, but I don't think it has that much impact on the overall character of the beer. Then after the mash, I go ahead and drain out that grain bag, and then I start heating up the wort for my 60-minute boil. So like I said, I'm using my homegrown hops, but the alpha acid on those, I'm not quite sure that they are. The last one I made was not as bitter as I planned, so I started off the boil that in 1 ounce or 28 grams of warrior hops. So supposedly that gave me almost 35 IBUs, so at least that's a good basis for a bitterness. With 15 minutes left in the boil, I added 4 ounces of my dried Chinook hops. So in theory, that gives me 47 IBUs. Yeah, I know that's not going to hit that much. I also added some Wurflock and yeast nutrient. With 10 minutes left in the boil, I added my table sugar in it. So 1 pound, or about 450 grams of table sugar. And then just before flame out, I added another 4 ounces of that dried Chinook hops. In theory, about 11 IBUs. I then used my immersion chiller to drop the temperature down to my steep temperature. So I steeped it at 180 degrees Fahrenheit or 82 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes. Added in my 10 ounces of wet Chinook. So these are the ones I harvested today. So in theory, even with adjusting the alpha acids down kind of lower in Beersmith, it says 8.8 IBUs. So all those IBUs kind of added up, but the beer turned out not really that bitter. So go ahead and chill the wort down before transferring it into my fermenter. So I started with 5 gallons of wort in the fermenter, but looking in the kettle, I could see there was a lot of more precious wort kind of hiding down those hops. So I decided to go ahead and sanitize my strainer and use that to get a little more volume. So that gave me about 3/4 of a gallon of wort. So now I'm a little bit above my 5.5 target gallons. So go ahead and direct pitch just by sprinkling on the wort 1 pack of Lallemand Nottingham. So I've not used Nottingham much in the last several years. I did enjoy it in that Simcoe Pale Ale that I made with Nottingham last year. So I would figure I would give it a try again in this batch and see how it turns out. So as a reminder, I'm calling this an IPA, but doesn't have any dry hops. So my pretty typical ale fermentation temperature. So started off around 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius. I rose that up to 69 degrees Fahrenheit or 20.6 degrees Celsius after fermentation started slow. Before packaging, I cold crashed it. And then I find Nottingham is usually a pretty aggressive yeast, and that was the case this time. So it was on day 10 I was able to put this one into the keg. And looking at the stats that I achieved, so again, I would not pay too much attention to that efficiency, 63%. Did I actually get that or not? I'm not sure. But I got an original gravity, 1063, attenuation of 78.5% brought me down to a final gravity, 1013, with an ABV of 6.6%. So I was pretty much right on my target. As I transferred in the keg, I had that extra volume in the fermenter. Well, I ended up overfilling my keg a bit. So it was filled up right to the top. So lots of good beer. So there's the beer. So I poured it in a shaker glass. So my kids gave me this Brent's Brews glass a while ago. So I figured I would break it. It'd be a good one for this beer. So I don't know if you can see the color on that. It's a nice kind of a golden color. I think it's probably similar to, say, like a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. It has a little bit of color to it. It's not overly dark. It's actually a pretty beautiful beer. It's dropped pretty clear over the time. This has been in the keg for, I don't know, at least a month now. Actually, this has been in the keg for about 2 months. You can see it's fairly clear. I mean, there may be a little bit of haze if you look at it. I find those kind of English yeast tend to drop fairly clear, even though, a lot of the English yeast have a reputation for making good hazy IPAs. So what about the aroma on this one? So, it's interesting. So it's Chinook hops primarily. A little bit of some of that triple pearl in there. So the aroma on it, it doesn't hit me like I expect, like, commercial Chinook hops and what I've used before with, packaged pellet hops. So I brewed a similar beer with the same hops that I grew 2 years ago. I get some of that same character. So I get like maybe a pineapple-ish kind of a fruity character. I also get maybe like a melony character. There's also a little bit of a kind of a spicy character in it. That could be the Chinook itself. Could be from some of that triple pearl in there. So I give it to a friend of mine. He said he really got kind of a marijuana dank smell to it. I don't quite get that. Maybe I'm not quite as experienced with, marijuana smells as he is, but I don't get a lot of that, prototypical pine to it. There might be a little bit of pine, but I get more, that pineapple, a little bit of cantaloupe, maybe a little bit kind of like a berry aroma to it. It's an interesting aroma. Is it what I'm looking for, say, in an American IPA? That might be another question. All right, well, let's go in, taste the beer. So the beer itself has a lot of good things going for it. The beer is not dry hop, so it doesn't have that hop intensity of like a typical IPA, or what I really like in an IPA. So it's probably got some character, maybe some older school IPA. So there's a good amount of bitterness in it. It's clearly not like 100 IBUs. Is it 60 IBUs? I would say if somebody said this was like a 60 IBU beer, I'd say, yeah, that's probably about right. There's definitely a bitterness, but it's not really intense. It's not really that lingering. The hop flavors, a lot like the aroma, a little bit that kind of pineapple, maybe a little bit of berry, a little bit of melon, a little bit, and then there's definitely a spicy character you get on the taste. How much of that comes from, say, like the Nottingham Yeast, or how much that comes from, the Chinook hops, or how much that comes from that little bit of that, like triple pearl is in there. It's a little hard to pick those out specifically. Overall, I would say, it's a pretty interesting beer. It's actually pretty good. One of the tests that I have for a beer, if you drink a beer and then you finish it and you're like, hey, maybe I'll go back for some more. So I find myself doing that a couple times where, I poured myself, 12 ounces, I drank it, kind of like, I want some more of that. I went back and got some more. So I always think that is one of the ultimate tests of a beer. Do you really like it? Do we crave it? Do we go back for some more? Like, this one is not exactly what I'm looking for in like a big hoppy, big IPA, but it's got a lot of good characters to it. So if we break out a couple things, let's look at a little bit growing hops. Let's look a little bit at the grain bill on this one, and then looks a little bit at the Nottingham yeast. So is it worth it to grow your own hops? I don't know. One of the downsides, I think, like if you're growing your own tomatoes at home, one of the benefits is you get really great tomatoes that are much better than what you can get at the grocery store. It's kind of a lot of money to grow tomatoes at home, but there's definitely that payoff. Growing hops at home, I think that's kind of a different, because I think you get higher quality and better hops from a hop farm that's growing them in, let's say, in an ideal region like the Pacific Northwest, or a hop farm maybe even in a different area, though they're dedicated to growing hops. They know how to process the hops, they know how to package the hops. So in my case, I'm growing hops in my backyard here in Virginia weather, our winters, sometimes we get these really harsh cold snaps. We don't have the ground's snow level to insulate it. Sometimes we get a lot of freeze and thaw winter. So sometimes Virginia is not the greatest for growing, some plants, especially perennials, that like to grow further north. So the amount of rainfall during the summer here is kind of pretty variable. Usually it's pretty dry. As I recall last year, there seemed like a pretty kind of intermittent rain. I didn't have to water the plants much, but maybe that was a downside. Maybe I did actually need to water the plants more than I thought. Then often in the fall, we get a lot of rain. This time the fall was kind of dry. So I guess my takeaway, growing hops at home, it's kind of fun. It makes a unique beer. So the downside of growing hops, it's a little bit of work, a little bit of money, It's a little bit of a hassle trying to schedule a brew around, especially in this case if you're trying to harvest and brew at the same time. The quality of the hops I'm growing at home, I don't think they're quite up to par with like commercial hops I'd want. But I'm going to keep growing hops. I'm going to keep making beers just because they're unusual. So what about the grain bill on this one? It's a little hard because I wasn't quite sure where I hit my numbers. I had to add that sugar in there. But I really like the idea of sort of a little bit of crystal malt, a little bit of Munich malt. So I know there's a trend for no crystal malt in IPAs. I do think it adds a little nice color, a little body and sweetness, especially when you're talking about a big IBU beer, something to balance that out. The Vienna malt in this one, I think it adds a little bit. So sometimes I taste it and I get a like, oh, it's kind of like, not really like a Marzen Oktoberfest, but you definitely can get a little bit of that character, that Munich and the Vienna coming through. So overall, I think I'm really happy, with the grain bill. Probably going to build off that in future IPAs, whether I'm making more of a classic American IPA or making one of these more modern West Coast IPAs. The idea of using a little bit of Munich, maybe using a little crystal. I'm not sure if the Vienna, but I think that Munich crystal base malt would be a pretty good combination for my IPA. And then what about Nottingham? So one of the things I say Nottingham, it's definitely a performer. It's easy to use, it ferments fast. In this case, do I get a lot of Nottingham character? It's really hard to tell, like what is the character of the Nottingham versus what is the character of the hops. Like I said, there's definitely a little bit of kind of a spiciness to this. Is any of that coming from the Nottingham yeast or is that all from the hops? So I like this beer enough with Nottingham that I'm going to continue using it. I like that Simcoe Pale Ale that I made with Nottingham. So might be kind of interesting. Do a split batch with Nottingham versus USO5 or Nottingham versus SO4. So if you like this kind of content, grain to glass videos, brewing on simple equipment, trying out new ingredients, well make sure you hit that subscribe button and check out some of the other videos I have on my channel. Cheers!